Hello and welcome to Media MD. I'm Reuben Morehouse.
And I'm Elliot and Reuben.
Each fortnight on Media MD, we recommend each other a piece of media that the other person has somehow missed.
Yes.
Alright, so this fortnight, it's my turn, and I'm bringing you a book by Stephen King called Salem's Lot.
Yeah, and I think this very much fits the criteria because I have never read a Stephen King book.
Yes, and I wouldn't call myself an expert, but I haven't also read a lot of them.
Okay.
I also haven't read a lot of them, but this is one of the ones that I have read.
Yeah.
In fact, I actually listened to this on an audiobook, but that still counts. I'm going to give you... I have the physical book here. It's pretty hefty.
Yeah.
So I'm going to bring this one to you.
Wait, doesn't Stephen King just write like a maniac? He writes a lot. Right?
Yeah, and he has so many books now. Right?
Yeah, and they're all big. Whereas you've got.
He does have short stories as well.
Yeah. Okay.
So, wrong. Idiot. All right. Anyway, let's get to Salem's Lot. So, do you know anything about this book?
I mean, I'm assuming based on the title, it has something to do with witches. Witch trials.
So Salem, it's actually 'Salem''S lot, and that's because it's short for Jerusalem's Lot, which is the name of the town that the book is set in. It doesn't have anything to do with witches. It has to do with vampires.
That seems intentionally misleading.
Yeah, it's not about the Salem witch trials. So last week you brought me Frankenstein.
Yeah.
Which was a book that was, last fortnight. Which was a book that was gothic horror, in air quotes. For the audio medium, you can't see I'm doing the air quotes, but this is a book that I would class as actually scary.
Yes.
So Stephen King does write horror.
It is a particularly famous one. Yeah.
But obviously, I would say it's pretty hard to scare me with a book nowadays.
Yeah.
You know, it's such a...
it's not as we talked about, we're spoiled these days.
We're spoiled for being scared. But this is a book that came out in 1975 and is still... I listened to it just a year ago, or half a year ago, and it spooked me. It spooked me good.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a scary book, for sure. And I want to talk about vampires, because this is a book about vampires where the vampires are actually scary and actually feel like a threat, right?
Oh, that's good.
And vampires are such a trope.
I mean,
nowadays,
they're not underdone. But I mean, even before Twilight.
So let's just quickly get out of the way. Team Jacobs, Barkley vampires, blah blah. All right, now let's move on. Yes.
Yeah. So even before all that happened, I mean, they were still sort of so ingrained in pop culture that they'd lost a lot of their impact.
It's hard to be scared of something that is so defined.
Yeah, and common. Yeah, but you're right. Defined. There were the rules with the garlic, and the mirrors, and it's.
Yes.
And if you really had to fight them, there's so many easy things you could do, like not invite them in your house. Just stay at home. Yeah,
and vampires are something that have been so subverted. Like What We Do in the Shadows, the movie about vampires.
There was that movie, Interview with a Vampire.
Yeah, there have been so many movies like that subvert vampires and approach them in a non-horror way that it's hard to be scared of them. But this is a book where the vampires are traditional vampires, you know. Like, obviously with vampire myths, some of the things apply at some points and some don't. So I think you have to invite them in, they only come out at night. I'm not sure about garlic, but they're like deathly afraid of crucifixes, and the power of faith is obviously something that's a big used against them a lot. And the main vampires, the vampires in Salem's Lot really follow the traditional vampire kind of formula, but it's still done in such a good way that it's still engaging and still scary. Yeah. The other thing I want to talk about with this book is it's a pretty hefty book, and I'd say the vampire shenanigans start about halfway through. Stephen King is he's obviously such a famous author, and that's because he's good at writing.
Sure.
You can really tell because the first half of this book really sets up the town, Salem's Lot, and all the characters.
Yeah. Okay.
And then that is what carries it through. There are still some elements of kind of mystery and intrigue, like a kid goes missing is one of the first things that happens in the book. And you can kind of tell where it's going because you know what vampires are. You know that this kid, if they get abducted, they're probably going to turn into a vampire.
Sure, but I guess from the town's perspective, it's just like a missing kid, which is a big deal, but not like we're being invaded by vampires, big deal.
Yeah, exactly. it definitely is a slow burn in that way. So things start happening with more and more frequency until eventually it gets kind of balls to the wall, vampires, fuck, you know.
Sure.
But it's still engaging through those earlier parts, which is definitely a credit to the writing abilities of Stephen King.
And so is this just like, this is the classic, like it's a small town...
Yeah.
Out in probably middle America somewhere.
Yeah, so Stephen King has said he wanted to write a sequel to Salem's Lot, but he can't because he wrote this at a time where the middle America town was still a thing, and that's kind of a thing that's dying off as globalization becomes more and more. This kind of isolated town isn't a thing that happens anymore. And that's why he's felt like...
Somebody better call the writers of Supernatural. It's not good news for them.
And add another one to the Supernatural reference counter that we keep for this podcast. No, but yeah, it's something that he said he would love to revisit, but he can't really do it in the same way.
No, that's just interesting because for me, I've always liked those stories that are set in that small town out in the middle of nowhere because that's sort of the town I grew up in.
Yeah.
I knew most of the people in the town and that sort of thing.
So if one of them turned up missing or turned into a vampire, you think you'd know?
I think like compared to like, you know, movies and stories and stuff set in big cities, I mean, it's just sort of the inverse. Like I always liked those stories about the small town because it was much easier to imagine like shit going down and then like if you don't have a car, there's nowhere for you to go and stuff like that. Yeah.
You can put yourself in the situation.
Yeah.
A lot easier as well. Yeah. And because it is a small town, there's never a feeling of like, oh, well, let's just call in the military and or anything like that. It doesn't really come into it at all because it's 1975 small town, you know.
And that thing where like the police or military presence or whatever you want is like 4 dudes.
Yeah.
So if they get taken out, like, you know, my hometown, I went back there recently and now they have 2 police cars that patrol around. Now,
budget. They've got some
crazy
budget increases. So something I'm realizing now is that this would kind of be comparable to something like Stranger Things, the Netflix show that I'm sure we've both watched because it's...
everyone's watched it
by now because it's a small town story, weird stuff starts happening, but it's still very kind of small town dealing with this.
And that was a very 80s sort of thing, and like I saw a lot of people compare it to the Stephen King thing. Yeah. So I enjoyed that. So
the comparison is definitely there. And it definitely also feels like that's kind of a more isolated incident with just... Well, I don't want to talk about Stranger Things too much, but a kid goes missing and that's the defining incident. Some other stuff happens. Whereas this is something that the vampirism is kind of like a plague, sort of. It spreads. And so it starts to affect the entire town in a way that it doesn't in Stranger Things. But it still feels like a small, isolated incident, which is very cool. And I guess I want to talk about the kind of realism of it as well. Because since vampires are such a trope, it's not really... I can't remember the last time I've heard a realistic vampire story, you know?
I see what you're saying. They're just sort of, a bit fantastical.
Yeah, for sure. So if you hear a vampire story nowadays, it'll be like, oh, you know, I'll just grab my garlic necklace and throw it at the vampire or whatever.
And they get a bit dehumanized.
Yes, for sure.
And so it's hard to view them as a legitimate threat, like because they're just like machines with rules. Yeah,
it's just like do this and then this happens and then this happens. Yeah. And while the vampires are still following those rules, because it really feels like a threat because of how the town has been built up. So there are characters that are built up and then people die in this book. Obviously, it's a book about vampires. People would die in this situation, and so you really feel it when you know whoever turns into a vampire. You're like, but I've known this character for the whole half of the book, you know. And so it's very realistic in that way. It's kind of like, I can imagine this is how this scene would play out if this is what happens. And that kind of really draws you in and makes it more scary as well in an interesting way.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so there isn't that much... I want to talk more about this book, but it is such a plot-based book that if I talk about too much about exactly what happens, I feel like I'll ruin it a bit.
So I have to save it for next time.
Yes, so next time tell me whether this spooks you, and we'll see how we go.
Give it a spooky out of 10.
And we're back 2 weeks later.
Here we are. So yeah, I've read or listened to parts of all of Salem's Lot, but I listened to parts of it.
Nice.
So yeah, I'll talk about how listening versus reading affected bits, but I'll go through the plot first.
All right, spoiler alert. Here we go.
So yeah, I just wanted to open with, first of all, I really feel like this was a story about the town. Like, I really feel like Jerusalem's Lot is, I don't really say the main character, but that's what the story was about. So I guess technically the main character would be Ben Mears, the writer.
Who's kind of like Stephen King puts himself into the story.
Yeah, like he's a writer, and anyway, so Ben's wife had died, and so he was writing some new novel, and he was scarred by a childhood trauma in a house in this small town he'd spent a few years in as a kid, which was Jerusalem's Lot. So he comes back and finds out the house has already been bought because he wanted to try and rent it to help him get over this trauma and
to give him inspiration as well for the book.
That's right, yeah. So anyway, yeah, like the house had been bought by this like creepy dude who was clearly just a criminal. And so essentially, yeah, Ben, the writer, is in the town for a bit, meets a girl, and really the first half of the book is just introducing the people in the town, or like as if it was just sort of building the town, and how everything worked in the town. And then anyway, sure enough, it turns out the people who bought the creepy old house on the top of the hill were actually like a vampire and his like human slave person.
It's like manservant.
Yeah, which it made practical sense that you'd have like a manservant like that.
You can go out during the day and move your coffin from one place to another.
Yeah, so
practical tips for vampires in this book.
Well, we've got to hit a new target demographic with the podcast. We've gone for that vampire market.
The 5 habits of highly effective vampires.
You won't believe number 4.
Yeah.
Anyway, so anyway, the town sort of starts to get turned into vampires. Also, first, like, kids start going missing. People are getting sick. Nobody can really figure it out. Anyway, eventually
dog gets like gutted.
That's right. Yeah, there's like a dog stuck on a post in the cemetery. People start to freak out a little bit, but no one's sure. Anyway, a couple of the main characters figure out it's vampires. Things escalate. They manage to kill the big vampire, and there's only 2 of them left by this point. It's this guy, Ben Mears, and then like some nerdy kid who was clearly Stephen King as a child. And then they sort of kill the main dude, but then there's like the rest of the vampires still there, so they sort of just run away. Yeah,
and that includes like the woman that he starts falling in love with.
Yeah, she gets turned into a vampire and he has to kill her, like just stab her through the heart, and it's it's pretty traumatic for him, I guess. I haven't been through something like that, so I can't. I can't relate.
I felt like he was really the everyman, and that was an experience we all go through, stabbing our loved one through the heart as they turn into a vampire.
But yeah, and then in the epilogue, and it's sort of about him and the kid. They come back and they sort of burn the town down to try and kill the rest of the vampires, and talking about how they'll probably have to hunt a few survivors, but more or less they think it's pretty much going to take care of it.
Yeah, but that's like years later. So they run away.
I got confused about that. Like I read the epilogue, but like because it's half done in the prologue right at the start and then half done in the epilogue. So when I was reading the epilogue, I was like, wait, so how much time is meant to have passed? Because the prologue is basically them deciding to go back after living in Mexico.
Yeah, after running to Mexico.
Yeah, basically. And then I had the impression that they spent like 10 years in Mexico and went back from the prologue, but I sort of went and read it on the wiki, and the wiki sort of implied that it was just a year that they were in Mexico and they went back.
Okay, yeah. But it's not really that big of a deal, I guess.
Yeah, anyway, so that's basically what happened.
Yeah. Cool.
So, yeah, I mean, going back to sort of one of the things I said at the start, I really felt like this was about the town more than the individual characters.
Well, it's called Salem's Lot. It's not called Ben Mears'
Ben Mears'
fun time experience.
Happy vampire adventures.
Holidays.
And yeah, I mean, that really came through. So like there's like the prologue, which is just about setting up mystery. It doesn't really tell you anything.
Yeah.
And then you've got like chapter 1 is about Ben. And even though so the chapter is called Chapter 1, Ben, and it's about like him coming back to the town. But even then, the chapter focuses more on his relationship with the town as a kid than it does about why he's coming back. It briefly mentions like, oh, my wife died, but I'm really coming back here because my childhood trauma apparently means more to me.
Yeah.
And then chapter 2 is called Susan, and it's all about him meeting Susan,
who's the woman that he
that he falls in love with. And like I know it's still like they spent half of it talking about the town when they were kids, and and all that. But like that one was probably more about the character. But then chapter 3 is literally called The What, and this was probably my favorite chapter. It's the one where it goes through a day in the town.
Yeah.
And so it's like each chapter's split into, you probably didn't get this in the audiobook, but each chapter split into like little sections. So I noticed when it was in the audiobook, between sections, the narrator of the one I was listening to would just pause for like 5 seconds. But so like each chapter would have maybe on average like 15 of these sections. And so in the Salem's Lot chapter, it was like the first section is like 4 a.m. and it talks about a couple of things going on in the town at 4 a.m. And then it would be like 6 a.m.
Yeah.
And it just sort of went through a day and sort of talked about, this is what's happening at the school at this time. This is what's happening. And it set up the whole town, and it introduced a bunch of characters as well who like later on it'd be like, Libby Crockett sat down to have her dinner. I'm like, who the hell's Libby Crockett again?
Yeah.
And then Stephen King would bring up one unique thing, like he'd mentioned something from that first chapter that was about them. And you'd be like,
she's that woman.
This is the one with the baby or something.
Yeah.
And so that was just a great chapter because it allowed him in basically one chapter to build out a whole town of characters.
Yeah, and that's what I was trying to get at with the first part of the episode, was that the reason I felt like this was such a strong book was because he just spends so much time building up the town that is about to be affected by this.
You're right.
Huge calamity.
And so the edition you gave me was almost exactly 500 pages. And it's like the first section is just called Jerusalem's Lot. So it's one of those books that's divided into 3 sections.
Yeah.
They're pretty clearly 3 acts.
Yeah.
And the first one is almost exactly 200 of those 500 pages. And it's just called Jerusalem's Lot. And it's all of that build up. So I think the first sort of vampire death happens right at the end of that.
But there's stuff like a kid goes missing.
Yeah, exactly.
And stuff that obviously is hinting at this mystery that is building up, but it's not really...
the tension's always rising, but definitely that first act is all about just establishing the town.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that was something I sort of found really... I just thought was really well done. And like you really felt for this town because it was that classic small town that was dying off already. And the whole thing kind of felt like it was a metaphor for a small like rural town dying off.
Yeah.
And
I might just be making this up or embellishing, but if I remember correctly, there's themes towards the end of people moving away from the town because of what has happened or because of what is happening, and that kind of strikes to that being a metaphor for the death of the rural American town in a lot of ways. There's a
great scene right at the end of the book where it's basically just down to Ben and this little kid, and they go and find like the constable of the town.
Yes.
And they're sort of like, hey, we're got to tell you what's going on. And he's just sort of like, it's like vampires, right? And they're like, oh my God, you know? And it's like, what are we going to do? He's like, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
He's like, I'm just putting my stuff on my desk and I'm going to go live with my sister on the other side of the country. And that was really good as well because they're like begging him to sort of help them stand up to the vampires. And he's just like, nah, this town was dying already.
Like what's the point?
I'm out. Yeah. And that really sort of upped the drama in that bit as well.
So you said you wanted to talk about the difference between the book and the audiobook.
Well, yeah. So I felt like it was spookier when I was reading. And that might be like, so the reason I had to jump into the audiobook was because I realized I wasn't going to finish it in time. Because I do that thing. I read like a chapter before bed. So maybe it's because I'm reading at night.
Yeah.
That it's a bit spookier.
I listen to it at night as well. Okay. So I think that's probably relevant.
Whereas when I'm listening to the audiobook, it was like, sort of on my commute. So I'm like standing in the train, which is like sunny.
Yeah.
And
You're safe.
That might have impacted the effect of it.
Yeah.
I definitely was feeling more spooked when I was sort of sitting here reading.
That's interesting. I would say, I only listened to the audiobook. I didn't read it, but I would have thought that the opposite would be true because audiobook is more, to me, it would be more evocative than just reading it would be.
See, I don't know. This might just be a personal... I get more immersed when I'm reading. I know with audiobooks, I find myself doing other things while listening to
enough.
them. Whereas the book, completely sucks me in. And then as well, you're just sort of lying there after, reading about the vampires. And it's just like, okay, it's bedtime. So I better lock all the doors. And...
Get my crucifix ready.
Yeah, exactly.
There was one particular scene I was thinking of, which was definitely the scariest part for me. I want to see if you can just pick it.
There's a couple.
Don't take too long because it's dead air.
Yeah. I thought the scariest part for me was actually probably just right at the start, the two kids when they first got attacked. So that's like literally the first vampire attack.
Yeah, the very first thing that happens.
Yeah. I would have said for me that was the scariest.
Okay, that's interesting. I can understand that. I think before I get to the scariest part, the part where they actually confront the vampire in his basement or whatever, that's done pretty well.
Yeah.
Especially because the tension has been building up to this point, and people get injured. One of the characters falls onto like
the
knives and forks and stuff.
That was
gets impaled. And...
I didn't see that coming at all that was kind of scary because it was like the way it's done is you just find out the guy's died, but you're not really sure how, and so then you're waiting for the kid to tell the others how he's died. And the kid sort of does it, and you're expecting it's like, oh, he was attacked by a horde of vampires or vampire slaves. And it's like, no, they just set a trap where he fell down some stairs and landed on a bunch of knives. And you're like, shit, that's gnarly.
Yeah.
But so that added realness to the vampires, like talking again about that whole fantasticalness. That took away from the fantasticalness. Like, no, they'll just kill you. In a very normal way,
whatever way they can,
and that was terrifying.
But I would say the scariest part is there's a character who Ben becomes close friends with, who is, I think, a professor at the school, and he kind of helps he and Ben together figure out themselves, the vampires. And so they work together, but at one point Ben is staying with the professor, and the professor gets visited by one of these vampires. He gets visited by a vampire, but it's not him. He's in the other room, and someone else is getting visited by the vampire at his house. Is that right?
Yeah.
And so there's this scene where the professor guy is like huddled against the door, hoping that the vampire, like listening to what's happening in this other room and hoping that the vampire doesn't come in. That just like haunted me for a long time.
Okay.
Very terrifying scene.
Yeah. And it's especially like one of the scariest parts. So these were like very much Bram Stoker vampires. They followed all the very Dracula rules. And so they've got that sort of hypnotic gaze, and like when they tell you things, there's like a part of you that just wants to do it.
Yeah, they have this suggestion.
That hypnotic suggestion, and that's quite terrifying to think that like even though you know what's going on, they're possibly still able to manipulate you into doing what they want you to do.
Yeah, and it's this image of the vampire like hovering outside of your window, and you see it, and you lock eyes with it, and it's like, let me in, and you know that you have to invite it in, but you are still doing it anyway because of still suggestion.
And that happens to a few of the characters where they can't fight it and they accidentally invite them in.
Yeah.
And you have to like revoke an invitation. Like once they're invited, they can keep coming in.
Yeah.
It has to be explicitly revoked.
God. It's a scary book, even though it's vampires. It's such a cultural phenomenon, you know, like.
And I've never really read a horror book before, and so I think this was the first time I've ever been spooked by a book.
Yeah. Fair enough.
So I'll move on to some complaints, I guess. So one thing I wanted to bring up is, like I said, I like the way I tend to read books is I read a chapter before I go to bed.
Yeah.
The chapter length in this book was very arbitrary and inconsistent.
Yeah.
So there's one. So yeah, like I said, the copy gave me 500 pages. The second last chapter is 110 of those. Jesus. 500 pages. And then the next one is 6 pages.
Yeah.
So
maybe don't commit to specifically a chapter.
I went to read that one chapter one night, and I got like 20 pages in, and I'm like, this one's pretty long. And I looked, and there was like another like 90 pages left, and I was like, nope, okay.
I guess I'm done for the night. Yeah.
And so but the thing was, so normally chapters are sort of to divide the the book up into like digestible little chunks that like thematically makes sense that they're in those chunks.
Yeah.
I didn't really see a reason why this was just 110 long thing.
Yeah.
Like it felt like at the start of the book it was like that Ben chapter, the Susan chapter, the Lot chapter, and those were like very logical things. Then by the end it's like, oh, this chapter's called Ben 4. And it's meant to be the other one about Ben, but half of the chapter would be from somebody else's experience.
Yeah.
And so it just sort of felt like about halfway through the book Stephen just gave up on chapters, and he's just like, no, like it could have almost been more representative of his writing sessions than any sort of feeling he had about the structure of the book.
Yeah, fair enough.
I found the sections within the chapters much more reliable indicators of where I should stop,
and kind of the flow of the story as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So that's just sort of a meta complaint. The The only complaint I have from the book is there's one where it's Straker, who's
Striker, isn't it?
It's Straker.
Straker, my bad.
He's talking to someone, and so he's the vampire's like human slave thing.
Yeah.
He's talking to someone, and he's talking about how great bats are and how great wolves are, and just normal conversation.
Yeah, as you do.
And he
normal
basically
conversation for a vampire or Batman. That's it.
And so he just lists all the things that like Dracula turned into in Bram Stoker's Dracula. He's like, I love bats and I love wolves, and it's like, okay, like come on, red flags. Yeah. But then somebody else is sort of like, oh, you know, and I like dogs, and he's like, nah, I hate dogs. And I was like, but dogs are just basically wolves.
Yeah.
Like,
it's a weird complaint for you to have.
No.
So you think Straker should like dogs?
I don't know. I think it was right at the end of the chapter, but I just remember sitting there for like 10 minutes after I finished reading, going, but dogs are just wolves.
Yeah. Why? How can you like wolves and not dogs? I mean, maybe he's speaking to like the feral nature as opposed to domesticated.
I mean, yeah, there's probably some metaphor there, but anyway, yeah, that was just a little random complaint that I
when you said you had complaints, I didn't expect it to be the chapter length and the fact that Straker didn't like dogs. But okay.
No, I mean, and the only other thing is, and I sort of get this with a lot of vampire-y things, is, you know, so he took over that town very rapidly.
Yeah.
And so you think with that sort of thing, like, if you can take over a town of 1,000 people in a week, why haven't vampires sort of taken over already?
Taken over the world, yeah.
How are they still not public knowledge? And so, like, and I'm sure, like, you could just easily headcanon something.
I mean, I feel like a big point of the book is the vampires, or the main vampire, is so powerful in some aspects and so weak in other aspects. Like, he still obeys the traditional limitations. Like, he sleeps during the day and basically nothing. The daytime during the book is like the safe haven where they can actually do stuff.
And that's when they're running around there making stakes. They're trying to get people on their side and everything. And
it's like they're prepping for the nighttime wave of enemies that's going to come at them.
But it's very clear that when these vampires set their minds to it, they can take over large populations fairly easily. So there must be some sort of headcanon explanation you can invent as to why they remain like low down. Like, obviously, if they took over 3/4 of the planet, there wouldn't be any food left.
Yeah.
So they must like exhibit some restraint in that way. But like, I don't know.
You can probably make up reasons, but the reason is probably just that Stephen King wanted to have a small town vampire story.
Well, yeah, and so I read a bit about like the writing of the book after I finished it, and so basically, he read Dracula and he was sort of thinking about what would happen if Dracula came back, but in like 20th century America, and he was talking to his wife about it, and he sort of joked that he's like, oh, he'd probably just get run over in New York. And so then his wife was just sort of like, yeah, but imagine if it was like a small town, you could take it over without anyone noticing. And that was basically, he was like, oh, that was shit. The seed for the book. Yeah. And then he originally called it like The Second Coming.
Oh.
And
was it meant to be Dracula?
I don't think it was ever going to be named like that. Like, that's it. Like, find out about the vampire's past. You just know that he's old.
Yeah.
So I think that's the thing where it could have been Dracula.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Sure.
But, it was originally called The Second Coming, and then they told him that was too religious. So he named it after the town, which was Jerusalem's Lot. And then they're like, no, that same problem.
Salem.
So they shortened.
Oh, that's okay.
And it was the editor's idea to shorten the title to Salem's Lot.
Yeah. I mean, it works.
Yeah, but so that was just an interesting bit of trivia behind it. But like, overall, I thought it was like spooky, and if you ignore the way the chapters divide up the story, I thought like it was a well written, structured story.
It was a perfect book, apart from that and the dog thing. All right, cool. Glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah. So I guess I should give it a number out of 10.
Yeah, are we still doing that? Yeah, let's. I
think so.
Why not?
I give it like 7. It's fairly arbitrary.
Everything gets a 7. All right, let's end there.
Yep.
We have to cut that rating system.
Come on, something else.
Okay, thanks for listening to another episode of Media MD.
You're welcome.
You can take the part of the listener for this little dramatic reading. Yeah, so we have a Twitter, which is at MediaMD Podcast, I think it is. Mm-hmm. And we also, hopefully, by the time this comes out, we'll have a website.
Yeah.
Which is MediaMDpodcast.com.
Mm-hmm. We got a .com.
Yep. Yeah. So you can go on there and, there'll be fun interactive games for you to play. You can check out pictures of the hosts and rate us on a hot or not scale. All kinds of fun activities for the whole family.
Activities may not be included.
Yeah. So next week, we will be checking out a movie called Mega Shark vs. Giant Octopus. Finally putting to rest the question, is bigger better?
See you then.